Pulling the initial key is just the first step in a traditional green screen process. In order to have a more realistic composite, you must refine the initial key. This process is often just a series of trial and error adjustments until you get things just right. So if we look at our project here, you can see I've got my initial key, but I can already tell that the black levels for my character are a little light, and the edges of this key are extraordinarily jagged, so we need to refine this. If the interface of your application doesn't look like this, go ahead and just make sure the composition window is pretty large, and you want to make sure the magnification is 100%, and you are working at full resolution. Then just press the spacebar to grab your hand tool and make sure you can see all the way from the top to the bottom of your character. Now here in my timeline, I'll just make the timeline a little larger so I can select layer 1 and then go up under my effect controls. Here I have my Keylight key. And in order to have some semblance of perspective as to how this object is keying, I need to actually have reference with the background. So if you notice, our composition only has one layer. So I'm going to go in the upper left corner of my interface and navigate to the project panel here. And if we open the footage options, I'll choose the GS backplate and drag it directly underneath of layer 1. So now I have some reference for color correction. With my backplate currently active, I can visually tell that the black levels in this image are a little light. So I'm going to go up under the effect panel and I'll go to color correction and choose levels. Here, I'll get my histogram and I can see that I need to actually drag this left arrow to the right to make sure that I'm just getting my black pixels actually black in my scene. Now, I'm not going to make my brighter pixels any brighter because if you remember from my example project, I tinted the whole thing kind of blue. So we'll go back here to our refine project. I just want to make sure the luminance kind of lines up, specifically with the black levels. So now let's select layer 1, and we'll start our refinement by actually doing a foreground color correction. So here I'll scroll down and I'll go to my foreground color correction, and I just want to enable color correction. And it's a very minute adjustment, but when I turn that on, what I need to do is actually just bring down the levels here. So in order to do that, I'll actually just increase the contrast on my image a little bit, and I can bring the brightness down just a little bit more. So now his levels are getting a little closer, but here, I'll just increase the contrast a little bit more. There we go. So 115 and -7. Now I've got things kind of matched back. But as you can see, the edges of my key are kind of jagged. So in this situation, I'd go back up under my Keylight options here and just toggle Keylight off and on. And I can see that it's a pretty aggressive key. It's keying off a bunch of extra information in his pants. So here, what I'll try and do is actually adjust the screen gain a little bit, which brings the edges back out. But notice if I do that, I want to double check under my view options, my screen matte. So as I'm bringing my gain down, I just want to make sure that I'm not introducing any extra noise back into the image. So here, let's set a setting of around 114, and then we'll toggle back to the final result to see how things are set up. So here you can see I've got a little bit of extra pixels here in his shoulder. So I want to look at some of the options here under screen matte. I'll definitely want to go ahead and soften up the edge here a bit. So if we click and drag, you can see softening the edges definitely eases the transition on those edges. And sometimes when you soften the edges, let's choose something like 1.7. Sometimes when you do that, you introduce a little bit too much transparency. So you can adjust the clip rollback or the screen shrink and grow. So for this, I want to adjust the screen shrink and grow. As I drag to the right, you can see it's growing the selection. If I drag it to the left, it's going to screen it back a little bit. And obviously, you don't want to go too far. So let's go back to a more realistic level. So here, I just want to make sure the edge of my green effect is brought back, but we ended up growing it at a value of about 0.6. Since I introduced a little bit of green back around the edges here, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom and enable the advanced spill suppressor. If I turn that on and then off, you should see some of the green pixels that got reflected into his kind of shiny leather jacket disappear. So if you want to blend that back, you could just adjust the suppression percentage. I'm just going to leave that up at 100%. In order to decide whether or not we're finished with this part of the refinement process, you'd want to go ahead and press the space bar and see how the key actually plays. Because sometimes when you key elements, it introduces a fair amount of noise back into your key. So after you load up a few seconds, press the space bar again here, and we'll look at our project. And honestly, there's a little bit of noise around the edges here, but I think this is pretty good for what we're trying to do. Because remember, the heavy color correction that we're going to have and that big glow over transition, it doesn't need to be perfect. It just kind of needs to be close. So here, I'll press the space bar to stop. And I'll show you one other thing about tweaking the edges, and that's this option here, the key cleaner. If we go ahead and enable the key cleaner, notice its default settings will give me something kind of crazy. And I don't necessarily want to do that. So let's decrease the additional edge radius down to a value of only about 1. And then I want to introduce the reduce chatter option, which helps some of the rolling around the edges here. And I can see a little noise around the alpha edge here. And so I'll go ahead and increase the alpha contrast, and that'll sharpen up the color of the edges on our key. And then lastly, we can adjust the strength back down to kind of smooth this out. So if we toggle the key cleaner off and on, it just sharpens up the edges around the head just a little bit. And if you press the space bar, you can see it's actually helped reduce the edge chatter around the edges of his boots. So I'll press the space bar to stop playback. So as you can see, when it comes to refining the green screen key, there are a number of different options you have to go through. And just like I verbalized the process to you, I recommend verbalizing the process to yourself as you're working through. So as you continue to go through refinements, you can say things like, okay, I'm noticing the edges are kind of wiggling. So I can look over here and I notice there's something that controls edge radius and chatter. So I'll make an adjustment there. You get the idea. As you go through this process more and more, you'll get more and more comfortable with the different options available inside of Keylight. And as long as you use the preset and the effects and presets, you'll have an option to further refine things using the key cleaner as well as the advanced spill suppressor.